Good morning. You can hear me okay, everybody? Thank you. We have a large panel this morning, so I've given everybody instructions to keep to time, and I will ring the imaginary bell if they get close to time. This session is looking at Antarctic governance, its legal and policy issues, and the challenges for the future. Those that were at the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting and those that have been observing the Antarctic Treaty System over the last 5 years, 10 years, will see that there are new challenges as well as some existing challenges from quite a while ago. But the new and emerging challenges influenced in a great part by global geopolitics are things that confront us today. And each of my distinguished panel, excellent people, will have a contribution to that discussion. I will take questions of clarification only after any of the speakers. So just if you've got a question of clarification, put your button on. But I would like to give the chance to each of the speakers to make their presentations. We'll have a panel discussion, and then I want as much time as possible for interaction from the audience. And in terms of interaction from the audience, there's a prize today for the most intriguing or best or most revealing question from an early career researcher. In all of today's session, and Claire and I will make a guess about that at the end of the day and pass this book on. So my first speaker this morning to open our panel session is Mr. William Muntean, otherwise known as Bill. I'll just hand straight over to you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Tony. And just a general disclaimer, I've been retired from the U.S. Department of State for 2.5 years, so I am thoroughly non-diplomatic. And what I say here is attributed only to me. Nobody else will necessarily claim anything as what I say is belonging to them. This is a rather broad topic, as we all know. I think actually one of the biggest challenges that the ATS faces is not strictly policy, but perception. There are, as we all know, a number of concerns that exist about ATCM and about the ATS in general, including that there are no big outcomes from meetings such as this ATCM. We also have opposite problems of species, some being endangered and some being invasive. And so tracking those two opposite ends of the spectrum. We've heard a lot about transparency. This applies not only to information that the treaty parties have agreed to require amongst themselves, such as those in the EIES, or strangely enough, the inspection report is only required to be made public due to its environmental protocol angle. It's not actually required to be made public through the Antarctic Treaty, although it has long done so. While not necessarily an ATCM focused issue, but maritime management remains a major concern of the ATS. Of course, this is principally a camellar issue with MPAs and krill in 48.3, but also ASPAs in the ATCM do crop up here in maritime management. Then terrestrial management, particularly the management of humans. We're going to hear more about tourism, that particular subset of humans, later on today. But there's also a significant amount of human interaction with Antarctica through stations and cleaning up legacy waste and managing the creation of new waste, as well as just the overall footprint of the semi-permanent human activities there in Antarctica are going to continue to be critical. Geopolitics, yes. This is nothing new, though. Of course, the Antarctic Treaty was born out of geopolitical issues. Both the Cold War and local rivalries, particularly those between UK, China, Chile, and Argentina, all contributed to the creation of the Antarctic Treaty. So to have geopolitical issues in a new form rear its head, okay, yes, with consultative parties. Also concerns about dual use. I'm of the opinion that just about everything in Antarctica has multiple uses, whether it's scientific, sovereignty, tourism, other activities. Now what is getting interesting is that dual use activities, particularly those potentially related to satellites and telescopes, have the possibility of impacting activities outside of the Antarctic Treaty area, whereas most other previous dual use activities were confined to within the Antarctic Treaty System region. I must mention climate change, just because one must, but let's get real here, folks. Climate change is not going to be decided in any ATS forum. It will be decided amongst all countries, and that's being done through the UNFCCC. So really, from my perspective, it'd be great to talk about climate change mitigation or response. But just as the small low-lying countries aren't going to be solving climate change, even though they're being dramatically impacted, the loss of sea ice is happening in Antarctica. Warming is happening, but it's not going to be resolved through any ATS activity. I do want to highlight one thing that I found this season that I have not seen before in decades. And this falls underneath the peace category, unfortunately, and that was the deliberate attack by the Captain Paul Watson group against another ship. For whatever motives that they might have, and whatever level of lethality they thought they were pursuing, the deliberate ramming of another vessel by an organization is something that I have not seen reported on since the 1950s. And this is the Hope Bay incidents and other activities which again contributed to the formation of the Antarctic Treaty itself. So I find that to be the newest and most disturbing activity from this past season. Yes, I myself would love to have penguins protected, would also love for any other number of things to happen, that there are challenges within the ATCM and within the ATS. That is nothing new. And I do encourage us all not only to consider the challenges, but also to look at the ongoing successes. Ongoing successes range very broadly, from the virtual elimination of IUU fishing, ozone, that used to be a particular concern. We got the Montreal Protocol going through, and now what the ozone, the whole of the ozone is now 25th smallest or something like that this past season. It's being addressed. So there are issues that used to be areas of concern within the ATS that no longer are. That gives me hope that with continued engagement, we will see, for example, on tourism. We heard from the chair, Renee, that there was progress but not results. It'd be great to have continued progress and eventual results on that and on many others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. No questions of clarification, so I will hand over to Patrick Flamm. Patrick Flamm, it's your turn. Go.
Thanks, Tony. Oh, it's not on yet. Now it's on. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Akiho, for bringing us all together here to beautiful Awaji Island. I am a political scientist, so not a legal scholar, and I will talk about politics. And I will say a lot of the things that Bill has just said, but differently in different words. I have to say that this was my first ATCM that I was able to attend in the last 2 weeks as an advisor, and many of the impressions are still fresh. And I've been mulling over what to focus on here in my little input. This morning, I decided to reflect a little bit on this notion, similar to what Bill just has said, that the ATS is hampered by politics and/or geopolitics, which is not necessarily the same thing. And what can and should one do about this? And I have some unfinished thoughts in this respect that I want to share with you, also at the danger of stating the obvious maybe, or getting too philosophical as well, but here are my thoughts. First, there are politics about Antarctic policy issues, for example, negotiating a tourism framework, and then there are issues about world politics playing out in the Antarctic context. And unfortunately, as a political scientist, it's not always easy to analytically distinguish one from the other. The example with the emperor penguin is insightful here. On the one hand, some parties have probably concerns about how spatial protections for penguin colonies limit their freedom of movement in the Antarctic into the future. And on the other hand, the same parties might also, because of their current bilateral relations having hit rock bottom, simply they may not want to let the host country score any diplomatic achievements, and that might just be a large part of it as well. Arguably, we saw that also in context of the consultative party requests. But just to make this clear, and I'm repeating what Bill just has said, but I think it's important to say that again, geopolitics has always been part of Antarctica. Science and infrastructure decisions have always been also geopolitical. And because of power shifts in the international system, the relationship between the Antarctic Treaty System and the international system is being and needs to be recalibrated. That leads me to my second point, world politics. World politics, if you have not noticed yet, is a mess. Strategic competition between great powers, maybe since last week we're talking about strategic stability now, here's hoping. Wars and genocides, both with plural S. There's a widespread brutal might makes right behavior. The US-Israeli war against Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz are world historical strategic blunders, in my view. At the same time, for the first time in 20 years, there are more people living in autocracies than in democracies worldwide. At the moment, less than 30% of the world population lives in full democracies. Nationalist parties are polling highly in many of these democracies. At the same time, environmental institutions and protections are rolled back in many countries around the world. If I may just say so, New Zealand, the New Zealand government is deliberating whether to abolish the environmental ministry. Sorry to the translators for that pace of speed, while climate crisis impacts are accelerating inside and outside of the Antarctic Treaty Zone. Also, we have no major arms control agreements between the great powers currently, while the securitization of outer space is progressing fast. And of course, there's also AI, so-called AI as a disruptive, energy and capital-intensive technology. So overall, I'd say we are living in rather unstable, uncertain and dangerous times where international law is often disregarded. The 1990s, the end of history moment, is clearly over. Against this backdrop, just to put things a little bit into perspective here, I think the Antarctic Treaty System continues to work rather well. The Antarctic Treaty System is, on the one hand, an arms control treaty with a working inspections regime. Can it be improved? Yes, of course it can. Let's work on that. Some people are already doing that, sitting next to me, talking about other dual-use issues related to drones, for example, or undersea cables. A satellite context Bill has mentioned. Further, the ATS, through its protocol, is an effective environmental regime. Is it perfect? No. Is it too slow? Yes. But, as Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, quipped, politics is the art of the possible. That's Realpolitik for you. Or, to quote from a less reactionary German, Max Weber, the sociologist, described politics as the strong, slow drilling through hard boards with both passion and judgment. I'll get back to that in a moment. The ATS facilitates scientific cooperation and coordination. Will IP5 look like IP4 because of that? Probably not. There's less money around for science, fuel prices are much higher, science systems, especially between the West and China, are decoupling, but still academic freedom in Antarctica prevails. Overall, in this messy world, the Antarctic Treaty System provides this big global public good through multilateralism and international law. A nature reserve dedicated to peace and science. It's far from perfect, but it's still really rather good. We need to keep it that way. We need to defend this system. So how do we do that? Some thoughts. Practice deliberate Antarctic exceptionalism. Try and separate Antarctic issues from world political ones as far as possible. Be patient, don't panic. Try to find consensus, despite obvious consensus blocking behavior. Focus on preserving the institution and its norms while seeking out avenues for constructive engagement. Stay invested and keep investing in the Antarctic consultative meetings. Or building on Max Weber, if the strong, slow drilling of ATCM hardboards is what we must do, how do we sustain passion for the Antarctic and judgment about world politics? One last point. Antarctic politics doesn't only happen in ATCMs, it also happens in interministerial consultations in the capitals of respective ATCPs, consultative parties. There you have to explain the uniqueness and weirdness of the Antarctic Treaty System to your other government officials. You have to justify investment in polar research and infrastructure, and why it is important to send appropriately sized delegations to ATCMs to shape the discussions there, to defend the ATS norms, even though there is little progress in terms of measures and resolutions. So that's a question for you here today as well, from my side. What can be done to strengthen the Antarctic voice in those interministerial settings, in those capitals outside of ATCMs? Thanks.
Well, thank you. I particularly like your point about don't panic. Just turn my phone off for a second, sorry, that was the timer. Don't panic, it's a good bit of advice, actually. It comes in handy. The next speaker on the panel. Did you read your email this morning? Oh, well, there we go. I shall just check my notes to make sure, but as far as I'm concerned, the next speaker on the panel is Constance Johnson, and you have 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here. I'll be talking about transparency, and I have been working on this with Indy Hodgson-Johnston. However, we have had limited time to confer in the last few weeks because of the ATCM, so I might have branched out a bit, so my apologies in advance. I'll just start by saying that in the last 18 hours, I have absorbed quite a bit of new information about transparency. And I'll just pause and note that when I'm talking about transparency, I'm actually talking about transparency of ATCM governance as distinct from broader activities in the Antarctic. Anyway, in my 18 hours, what I've learned is that transparency was a significant topic of discussion at the ATCM. I wouldn't have known that if I wasn't here. What I also can't know at the moment is what happened at the meeting. These are observations that are not irrelevant to the issue of transparency. When talking about transparency, I think as a starting point, it is useful to be conscious of the academic and conceptual thinking about transparency and international governance and the evolving normative context. For example, it has been considered that there is a principle of international law which accepts the value of transparency in particularly environmental governance. The need for and value of transparency is also reflected in international governance, in the international governance landscape, for example in SDG 16, which specifically references transparency. So, we know we have a mandate to be concerned about transparency, especially regarding environmental governance. But what is transparency? Even in this room, just yesterday, we heard a number of different terms evoked. We've heard transparency, we've heard participation, we've heard openness, we've heard access. A common thread in the academic commentaries is that transparency is at least about access to information and data and can be about access to decision-making, policy-making, institutions or bodies. Also, transparency and participation are not always presented as the same thing. Participation is surely important to transparency, but it is possible to have transparent decision-making without participation. As a result, these two states or conditions, transparency and participation, though never divorced from each other, have been treated as being worthy of different considerations and factors. Also, different types of transparency have been explored, such as the difference between active and passive transparency. Active transparency concerns, for example, the proactive disclosure or publishing of information or having information always available. Passive transparency occurs where disclosure is reactive, where an organisation responds to user requests. So if we think about what transparency might not be, transparency probably isn't public relations. Both are very worthwhile concerns for an organisation, but are two different things requiring different considerations. Transparency is also not necessarily a question of quantity. More is not always better. Indeed, an information deluge can actually obfuscate transparency. Also, is transparency always a question of speed? As with many complex issues, the probable answer is both yes and no. There are other factors to be considered. If we go back to the ATCM for a minute and think about where it sits, if we look at international organisations and fora, there is not surprisingly a large spectrum of approaches. If we look at the ATCM, what we see is that access to documents, there is active transparency to a significant degree. If we look at participation and access, we have a range of states, certainly not the biggest fora in the world though, and we have IGOs and NGOs involved. However, there are some issues in relation to that. If we look at media access, the ATCM has made some beginnings, but does not have a fully formed approach as yet. So if we look about moving forward, what I've been thinking of is a triangulated approach that brings together, firstly, the philosophical and normative aspects of transparency and participation, secondly, the principles and objectives of the ATS, and thirdly, the tools at the ATS's disposal. First, it seems useful that the Antarctic Treaty Parties reach a common understanding of what transparency means to them, also what participation means to them. And this should include reference to the current norms in international governance. So as not to be out of step with the broader international legal system. These terms can mean different things to different people, and a shared and cleared vocabulary has foundational importance for future initiatives. The second step would be to relate those notions to the ATCM, and most importantly, the principles and objectives of its fundamental instruments. Thus, the Antarctic Treaty Parties can work out why they need transparency and the purposes that transparency and participation tools will serve. They need to know the why. It may be useful to look at the approaches of other fora and investigate where the ATCM needs to sit on the practical transparency spectrum. The third step would be then to identify the particular reforms or actions that serve the identified purposes in a meaningful way, but always looking back to the why. All I'm saying is that the existence of a clarified conceptual basis will facilitate practical implementation, resulting in a meaningful, coherent set of actions. This is instead of maybe a nibble here or a bite there. Regarding the third step, doing what I said not to do, start with the third step, but when the time is right, here are some practical matters that may warrant consideration. First of all, looking at NGO representation. One thing that strikes me is the process of annual invites. Is it time for a greater guarantee of participation? Also, in relation to NGO representation, there's the question of who. The ATCM certainly has a small number, just two, one environmental and one industry NGO, number of NGO reps. Is there a need to consider the breadth of NGO participation? Or is the streamlining working well? Also, are there opportunities for greater interaction that are not being utilised? For example, Rule 40 of the Rules of Procedure enables a party to propose the invitation of other international organisations. Rule 43 enables the chair to invite experts. In relation to some of the criticisms about the final report, are there ways to retain the benefits of the final report via the adoption of other practices such as some form of real-time reporting of meetings, such as occurs through the IISD? And finally, what about CAMLA? CAMLA is less transparent than the ATCM in some important regards. Is that worthy of the attention of the ATS?
Thank you, Constance. I'm glad you raised the issue of the difference between participation and transparency. That is probably a whole seminar on its own, but it's good to have it on the table in case people wish to address that particular issue. I will now pass over to Nengye and go for it.
Okay, I will speak slowly. Try my best. Thank you, Tony. Good morning, everyone. So my talk today is titled, If the ATCM is a special family for Antarctica, what kind of family is it nowadays? But first I would like to thank Professor Shibata for having us here in this wonderful place, and then congratulations Japan again for successfully hosting the 48th ATCM. I must say I just had an extremely enriching 9 days. It is always eye-opening to observe the ATCM, not just official statements and negotiations. Sometimes I just stood in the corridor and observe who is talking to who, and people's faces and atmosphere. So that's very inspiring. So in a recent issue of the European Journal of International Law, so Professor Susan Marks had a very long and thought-provoking piece called "If the World is a Family, What Kind of Family Is It?" So coincidentally, last week, I had a quick conversation with a good colleague in Hiroshima, in the meeting space, who was expressing his concerns about the CEP is difficult to make progress about the designation of emperor penguins as a specially protected species. I recall his words that if we are a special family for the protection of Antarctica, then we should work together and take measures to do so. I think this exactly triggers my thoughts on the talk today, and I'm just here to provide some preliminary thoughts on if the ATCM is a special family for Antarctica. What kind of family is it nowadays? I must quote Susan Marks again. I really enjoyed reading her piece that when we are speaking of a metaphor that has a long and rich history of use of when we speak of family, it is a metaphor that has a long and rich history of use for modeling associational life. When the word is represented as a family, as we always hear this here and there, that affects our understanding of the word, but it also affects our understanding of the family. So in her view, I agree that speaking of the word as family has a depoliticizing and a naturalizing effect. But as she argues that when you speak like that, family, we are all one family, it also tends to obscure important divisions and subsumes conflict and contestation under the banner of commonality. And especially, it is true that the patriarchal relationship of father and child has historically been invoked to represent colonial rule as a form of educative tutelage. And in the contemporary moment, when we invoke, the invocation of the child, have linked critiques of climate change to a vision of a reproductive futurism. I think the Antarctica is indeed special and unique. And the Antarctic Treaty System, by design, carries a sense of depoliticizing and naturalizing effect. It was built upon compromise, and I would call it détente, between the two Cold War superpowers, and freezes territorial claims by those claimants. The spirit of Antarctica, among scientists in particular, is very strong. Still today, I think when people are in an extreme environment, I had that experience in Argentina. I've never been to Antarctica, but in Argentina, when I visit Galicia's Ponte Moreno, I had a similar experience. You just bond together. So I think that is to a certain extent true, that Antarctica is a special family. But however, I think we shouldn't forget what this family carries from the beginning days till today, which is still vividly reflected to answer the question, what kind of family is it nowadays? So I have 4 observations. The first thing is colonial legacy. So here, the Antarctic Treaty, of course, comes out of the heroic age. But here, what I mean is this colonial legacy is the desire for exploring and eventually exploiting resources by countries. To date, I think most large economies in the world are extractive economies. Capitalism, and nowadays neoliberalism, I think they are getting stronger. And neoliberalism carries a very similar formula, that is boom, bust, and exit. So from krill to penguins, and also occasionally, as we saw in the media about the mining ban by the Madrid Protocol, I think neoliberalism and this mindset, I'm not saying everyone or every country, I'm just saying this mindset of seeing Antarctica as a new frontier is potentially overshadowing the discussions of CEP and Kamala. The second observation is Cold War construct. The Antarctic Treaty is a Cold War construct. It is to a certain extent a deal between the US and Soviet Union, the two superpowers in the Cold War. And today, in our time, we have US and China. But the US-China competition in our time is yet to fully play out. So until there is a real strategic stability, truly agreed by the US and China, as they call it last week in Beijing during Trump's visit, we are going to be in an unstable and dynamic ground for a while. I think that is also what is reflected in the ATCM. And of course, don't get me wrong, that when there is finally a so-called grand deal between the US and China, that might not necessarily be good news for the others. And the third observation of this family is hierarchy among states. From the Cold War time, we had two superpowers, and then after the collapse of Soviet Union, from 1990s to maybe recent time, we had the US unipolar world. I think there is always a hierarchy among states. Although in international law, we would like to say, and also I believe that there is an equality among countries. But indeed, in the international negotiation space, some countries are more equal than others. And there is even a legally recognized hierarchy in the ATCM as well. That is the consultative party and non-consultative party. And it seems that it is now even harder to get into the club, well, if you call it a club, of the consultative party in this century. I think I counted this morning, Ukraine got in 2004, then the latest consultative party was Czech Republic, which was admitted in 2014. And so far, we haven't had any new consultative party. So Malaysia's delegation actually raised this, or at least mentioned this question of Antarctica again in this year's ATCM. But I think it is still a valid question, but it hardly gets any warm response from others in the meeting. And finally, history. I think we shouldn't forget about history. China, Japan, India, and Pakistan. These are not an Antarctica problem or issue, but it's a burden that the ATCM is carrying, as reflected in this year's ATCM as well. So bilateral relations and geopolitics does play a role in the decision-making process of the Antarctica Treaty System. I still have some hope. I think climate change, which is an undeniable fact for the vast majority of the countries in the world, and people-to-people connections, bonding in an extreme environment, can drive countries to continue to stay engaged and make the ATS a truly special family that is dedicated for the protection of the Antarctica. I will stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nui. I like the fact that you raised the issue of what kind of family is it, because in a sense that covers one of the issues that is a major thing to consider in current practice, and that is how do families make decisions. Leads us straight to the question of what is consensus. And consensus is not what some countries are practicing. We'll get onto that later. I also ask you to consider, in looking at the Antarctic Treaty System, what's the counterfactual here? What would happen if the Antarctic Treaty fell over? Or what would Antarctica look like if this, as you described it, colonial regime hadn't been negotiated in the 1950s? I'll just put that on the table. I will now move on to the distinguished Karen Scott, who will take up the next 8 minutes of this discussion. Go, Karen.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. That's a very kind introduction, and I'd like to begin by thanking you and thanking Hiko for the very kind invitation to participate in this event. I'd like to use my 8 minutes to make a few remarks on the relationship between the Antarctic Treaty System, the ATS, and maybe a second cousin, the BBNJ agreement, to think about the broader family as it relates to the Antarctic. Specifically, I'm going to focus on one aspect of emerging practice, how Antarctic Treaty Party states have referred to the Antarctic in their declarations on signing or ratifying the BBNJ agreement and in their implementing legislation. Now, obviously, this is early days, given that the BBNJ agreement only entered into force in January, but the little practice we have thus far suggests a more complex picture of Antarctic engagement than was initially predicted. What I'm not going to do is discuss the different positions that states take on whether the Southern Ocean is beyond national jurisdiction, or how the BBNJ agreement might apply to the Antarctic or its relevant provisions relevant to its mediation with the relationship with the ATS. I looked at these issues in some detail in an article which I published last year. I'm also not going to discuss in any detail the apparent position that the ATCM has taken on the BBNJ agreement, or indeed the issues raised by the agreement, through its various resolutions primarily on bioprospecting, beyond noting that the position appears to be that the ATS has exclusive competence over matters Antarctic. It is, I think, however, relevant to note that an ATCM resolution proposed in 2024 welcoming the BBNJ agreement and asserting the competence of the ATS has not been adopted, was not adopted. So why focus on declarations and implementing legislation associated with the BBNJ agreement? Well, the reason is because both constitute state practice that is relevant to the interpretation of the BBNJ agreement, and that practice can inform a determination as to whether the agreement should, and if so, to what extent, apply to the Antarctic, and what obligations states owe under it in respect of the Antarctic. The first Antarctic state to issue a declaration on signing the BBNJ agreement was the UK. Its declaration asserted that the Antarctic Treaty System comprehensively addresses the legal, political and environmental considerations unique to that region and provides a comprehensive framework for the international management of the Antarctic. The declaration does not explicitly exclude the application of the agreement to the Antarctic, but it makes a very strong statement that it's the ATS which governs matters Antarctic. Now, I assumed at the time that this would actually be the first of a number of similar statements made by Antarctic Treaty parties, particularly Antarctic claimant states. But actually, this has not been the case thus far. Of the other Antarctic states that have made a declaration on signing or ratifying the BBNJ agreement, only Chile and Norway have referenced the Antarctic Treaty System, and even then, only in general terms in the context of Article 5, the Not Undermine clause of the BBNJ agreement. They don't go further in their declarations and assert any special ATS Antarctic competence. Belgium, Brazil, China, Denmark, Finland, France, Japan, Peru, South Korea, and Turkey have all made declarations under the BBNJ agreement, but have made no reference to the Antarctic at all, including France, a claimant state. Now, I would suggest that this practice is interesting and important. First, it demonstrates that there's been no formal or informal agreement among the Antarctic Treaty parties as to how they should engage with the BBNJ agreement with respect to the Antarctic. And this is in contrast, for example, to the informal agreement that treaty parties had in relation to the application of the Law of the Sea continental shelf process to Antarctica 20 years ago. Second, it further demonstrates that there's not necessarily a unified or even a consistent view between Antarctic Treaty Party states on how the BBNJ agreement should apply in the Antarctic. Now, this complex picture continues if we look at the legislation adopted by Antarctic Treaty Party states implementing the BBNJ agreement, and again acknowledging that we're at a very early stage. It's interesting, I think, to contrast the UK legislation with the Australian legislation. Notwithstanding the UK's fairly robust declaration on signing the BBNJ agreement, the UK has not, perhaps surprisingly, excluded the Antarctic ipso facto from the scope of its implementing legislation, the 2026 Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Act. It has excluded the section implementing the BBNJ agreement on marine genetic resources, or MGRs, from the Antarctic Treaty Area, so that is south of degrees south latitude. And by implication, it would apply the BBNJ agreement to MGRs north of that latitude. It does not directly reference the Antarctic in the context of its implementation of environmental impact assessment, but relies on the equivalence exception under Article 29 of the BBNJ agreement. Similarly, there's no reference to the Antarctic in the section implementing the BBNJ modalities on area-based protection. Again, the UK is relying on the BBNJ provisions itself to moderate the relationship between those regimes. As a claimant state, the legislation does include an interesting provision that asserts that a relevant maritime zone of any British overseas territory, and that includes the British Antarctic Territory, is to be treated as if it were an exclusive economic zone, and therefore implicitly falling outside of areas beyond national jurisdiction. So the UK has effectively excluded the BBNJ agreement in a 200 nautical mile zone off its Antarctic territories. Australia, on the other hand, has taken a much more robust approach in its High Seas Biodiversity Bill, which has passed readings in both houses. It has excluded the application of the BBNJ agreement in relation to marine genetic resources, area-based protection, and environmental impact assessment from the Antarctic Treaty Area and from the Kamla Convention area, that is to around 45 degrees latitude. The explanatory memorandum of the bill asserts that these exclusions are consistent with Article 5 of the BBNJ agreement and the not undermine clause. I would, with the greatest of respect to my esteemed Australian colleagues, disagree with this assessment and suggest that actually the whole point of Article 5 is not to exclude the application of the BBNJ agreement altogether, but rather to work with other regimes in a compatible manner. There are some specific problematic issues with the Australian approach, which I don't have time to go into, but happy to pick up in questions. By contrast, neither Germany nor Norway has excluded Antarctica in their implementing legislation as far as I can see, although Norway has asserted that its legislation does not apply to Queen Maud Land unless determined otherwise by the King. So what are the implications of the practice thus far? Well, I think we can conclude that Antarctic Treaty parties do not, in fact, have a consistent position on whether and to what extent the BBNJ agreement should apply in the Antarctic. It'll be very interesting to see how other Antarctic states approach the issue. And of course, it should be noted that neither the United States nor Russia are likely to ratify the agreement. Of course, it is still possible that the ATCM will issue a collective position asserting general primacy over the regulations of activities taking place in the Antarctic. But this is actually going to become harder to agree in the face of increasingly diverse approaches to engagement with the agreement among its treaty parties. My view is that proactive and positive engagement is a much better approach to some of the defensive statements that have been made to date. And I'm going to be developing this theme at the workshop on Tuesday in Kobe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We could probably have a whole conference on this, but let's leave that question or those questions open. And there are people in the audience here and on this bench that might want to speak to it. I shall now hand over to the very, very distinguished Sanjay Chaturvedi.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. What an honor and privilege. And I'm very grateful to you in particular and the Polar Center for giving me this opportunity. Mr. Chair, please allow me to address everyone sitting here as Antarcticans. Not in the sense of territoriality, but in the sense of the responsibility and accountability we all share. When we cross the boundary, that is through roaring 40s, furious 50s, and screaming 60s, those of us who have crossed that would perhaps agree with me that what we undergo is a deep transformation. And that is where I think the exceptionalism of Antarctica and the Antarctic governance rests. Longue durée, 1950s was a very important decade when the Antarctic Treaty negotiations happened at the peak of the Cold War. Let me take you to 2050. 2048, of course, is a year we are all concerned with. But what will the world look like by the time we are there in 2050? Geopolitics of 1950s, geopolitics of today, geopolitics of 2050 are not going to be the same. In fact, technopolitics or techno-geopolitics is just one example that is also making its inroads. 85% of world's fresh water in Antarctic, 16 meters of sea level rise, if I'm not mistaken, in that ice. It is not going to be that easy for those who are entrusted with this responsibility and accountability to govern Antarctica to meet these challenges. That also takes me, Mr. Chairman, to a question which I think we should keep returning to, and that is, what is Antarctica? Is Antarctica nature? And those who have assigned to themselves some kind of a trusteeship of family? What is it that we are governing? Is it the continent, Southern Ocean, associated and dependent ecosystems, or the entire planet Earth? I think these questions are going to become larger than life as we move closer to 2050. When we talk about the emperor penguin debate that is unfolding before us right now, I think we need to ask ourselves which value, one of these intrinsic values of Antarctica, is at play. Is it the question of transparency? Is it the question of lack of understanding, or a value which has not received the kind of attention it deserves, and that is trust? As a matter of fact, the path of Antarctica governance is the middle path. 1950s, we had a lot of mistrust, and yet there was this attempt to have institutional innovation. And if we look at the history of Antarctic governance and its evolution, there has always been an oscillation kind of a process between trust, mistrust, fear, and hope. And my submission is that all governance architectures rests on three important pillars: legitimacy, authority, and effectiveness. Now, legitimacy is not something which is cast in stone. Context change, perceptions, as I've already been pointed out, change, hierarchies change, knowledge power equations also change. So that is a question which the Antarctic Treaty System as a collective will continue to face. And there's no getting around it. The second question, authority, and the third is effectiveness. And I want to just say a few words about effectiveness and then stop. And I think one of the major challenges that the Antarctic Treaty governance is going to face in not too distant a future is bioprospecting. And this is where it will not be only with the geopolitical question of access, but it will also raise a plethora of normative issues, including equity. And as we go closer to Hague, the city of justice, I can anticipate a very useful and fruitful discussion around this concept of equity and justice. Now, one point with which I would like to conclude my brief intervention relates to something which I have noticed both as an academic who was at one stage also getting closer to the policy domain, is that of an institutional memory. And I think this is where we are going to face a major challenge, in the sense that if we care to look back into the catalogs of discussions that have happened on the case, for example, on the question of tourism, we can say that there are lots of issues which now we feel are coming back, but they never went away. In fact, they were there on the agenda, they were being discussed, and then for reasons unknown or unexplored, those baskets of issues went off the list of discussion and conversation. So my concern is that we might see a transition from a collective memory to collective amnesia when it comes to Antarctica governance. And therefore, it would be extremely vital and extremely useful for us to not only look at the concept of data transparency, or a very important working paper which the Secretariat has set up about the data part, but also look into the larger questions. Because the question of institutional memory is also related to trust, a value which is still understudied and under-theorized. Could it be that it is because of the growing turnover of delegates and negotiations? Could it be because of the expansion in the number and diversity of Antarctic Treaty System actors? Could it be because of the declining continuity among long-standing Antarctic experts? Do we see a generational shift in this respect? Could it be because of the increasing issue complexity with regard to tourism, bioprospecting, climate change, and of course geopolitics that we have all discussed? So one thing I would like to conclude with this submission, that the three pillars of Antarctic governance, legitimacy, authority, and effectiveness, will continue to invite, demand, and deserve much greater attention, not only from policymakers, but also from academia, from social scientists, and together, the academics and policymakers will have to find answers to these questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. I appreciate very much your comments about trust, legitimacy, and authority, and particularly when a complex regional suite of organisations that manage the Antarctic and govern the Antarctic are faced with difficulties, faced with huge challenges like climate change, in the middle of a fractured international geopolitical environment, a fractured one and we still don't know where that's going to end up. It does mean that it is being challenged from inside and from outside, sometimes from friends and sometimes from those that aren't friends of the system. So I think it's worth exploring those issues throughout today and also into our discussions for those of us that will end up in Kobe. So I'm now going to throw back to the panel. And the very first thing I'm going to ask, is there anybody on the panel that wants to respond or make a comment on anything the other speakers have said before I start to ask you questions and then throw over to the floor? Does anybody want to follow up on either what they said themselves or what any of the speakers have said? Constance.
Thank you. I was just very interested in Sanjay's point, especially about biological prospecting. That's something that's been on my mind for a while. I think that is a vulnerability for the Antarctic Treaty System. The Antarctic Treaty System response at the moment is not to have any regime, but to say that they are governing the matter, which there's a kind of a disconnect there. And I think that any vulnerability or issues there may be thrown into sharper focus by the BBNJ agreement and its emphasis on marine genetic resources.
Does anybody else wish to make a comment? So here I go then. Over to the audience, over to the panel, and my question is, what is transparency to you as a panel in terms of Antarctic governance? I'm talking about meeting processes and decision processes here, as opposed to communications. Bill.
All right, so we put you to work by forcing you to ask a question, so I guess we better respond to this.
You don't have to.
Well, so transparency, so I'm going to do the good policymaker diplomatic response of "it depends." And in this particular case, we've got the Antarctic Treaty System, which is 4 separate agreements, plus all the decisions and whatnot that the ATCM and CAMLR have come up with. And so there does not need to be a single transparency decision that applies equally across the ATS, because each of those agreements has its own special purposes and everything. It's noteworthy, from my perspective, that participation, which of course, as we now know, is not equivalent to transparency, participation in each of those 4 agreements is not the same. The area covered in those 4 agreements are not the same. The common denominator is referenced back to Antarctic Treaty Article 4, sovereignty. That is what makes an ATS agreement an ATS agreement. So I say embrace the differences. There can be different levels of transparency and governance for a CEP, which is more equivalent to an environmental agreement than to the ATCM, of which environment is one of many factors it considers. Similar, CAMLR would be more similar to CEP than it would be to ATCM. So identifying differences, drawing distinctions, and benefiting from them in different ways would be my way of encouraging transparency be tailored to the needs and desires of the particular agreements. Thanks.
Sanjay?
Thank you very much. I think it is possible to look at the question of transparency at multiple scales. When it comes to intra-system transparency, can we say that there are areas where we see opaqueness? It can be because of various reasons. Because the governance architecture of Antarctica has become very complex. Somehow we have maintained a binary between the terrestrial and the oceanic. Those who are attending the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings may not have enough transparency vis-a-vis the conversations that are unfolding within CAMLR. Another level of transparency is interdelegation transparency, where for all kinds of reasons we have seen for a very long time, and I think it still exists, a culture of silence at the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings. And those who choose to be silent perhaps do not realize that silence can also be a source of suspicion. And the third, of course, is that transparency requires a dialogic mode, not simply a pronounced statement or a statement of pronounced position in terms of yes, no, or we congratulate so-and-so in the Antarctic Treaty. Another level of transparency is in terms of the ability of the Antarctic Treaty system for outreach. Although it is heartening to note that we do have a number of very interesting and important initiatives to outreach. But then it is not simply the value of Antarctica as nature that has to be conveyed to the rest of the world. But I think the world also has a right to know, or at least expectation to know, that how, in what sense is the Antarctic being governed, and what is at stake in this governance for the humanity at large. So I think this is where I can also see an interplay between transparency and trust. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen?
Thank you, Tony. I would like to slightly amend your question, or perhaps add a question in a typical academic style, and kind of ask, why is transparency important for Antarctic governance? And I would suggest that the key reason, or a key reason, is trust, to come back to the point made by Sanjay earlier, and really responding to the idea that the Antarctic Treaty parties are purporting to manage Antarctica on behalf of humankind. It's that connection. So if that is the ostensible aim of the Antarctic Treaty system, and indeed what underpins the privileged position of the states which are party to the Antarctic Treaty, then I would say transparency is fundamental in order to maintain that trust. So I would suggest that if that is the reason for transparency and that kind of connects it to governance, then that sort of prioritises, why we need to have transparency.
I'd just like to add to that what Karen and Sanjay have just said. This was exactly where my thinking was going as well. Very much coming at this from an arms control, peaceful use of Antarctica angle, because transparency is the precondition for trust because of trustworthiness. In order to be seen as trustworthy, you need to share information about what you're doing. And if there's any perception of murkiness in that space, that's a problem because it gets at your trustworthiness. So that's the connection here, I think.
Thank you. I'm now going to go to the audience. We have a set period of time here. And remember, please, early career researchers, ask any question you like, but I'll start off with you. No, you with your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Michiel Lammers. I'm from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. In relation to the discussions on transparency, I was wondering, and it's also something we heard yesterday, that also in observing, let's say the ATCMs over the years, it seems that on the one hand, there's maybe a need for more information papers, more background papers, more information to be tabled in order to increase the understanding in certain policy domains. While that may also create difficulties in decision making, for example. It seems that there's kind of a fine line or a balance between these two issues. I've in my own research sometimes been wondering about, also in my own studies in tourism, for example, in the Antarctic, how for a whole range of tourism activities, for example, the authorizations or the environmental impact assessments of different Antarctic parties, let's say, cannot be found really on the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat website, for example. And I was just wondering, so that is more a sense of information that is lacking, crucial information that is lacking, while on the other hand, I also get a sense that there's a lot of information being tabled. I was just wondering, if the panel would be able to comment on that.
And maybe somebody in the audience might want to comment on that. I'll let Phil do that right now before I go to the question from the person back there. Phil, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment on that from our perspective in Australia, but also my own perspective also. I think things in Antarctic governance operate at different scales. We get together as representatives of nations at the highest level of government interaction, and Antarctica is one of those places where sometimes we end up talking about individual activities of for example, a single private entity doing a yacht voyage to Antarctica. So there's a point, for me at least, where we have to have a balance between spending the effort of government at that level, looking at very, very specific things which would be almost unheard of in other international contexts, rather than reserving our time and resources for the big picture discussions and the big settings and the big mechanisms that we need. Specifically on that topic of access to information about environmental assessments, it's a really good example where we have that question of scale. The protocol establishes that the big things that will potentially have significant environmental impacts must be consulted internationally through the development of a draft CEE and the circulation of that environmental impact assessment. But the protocol didn't require that for activities that go down deeper into the smaller activities. And so for many tourism activities, for example, parties will be assessing those as in accordance with the protocol's provisions for preliminary environmental evaluations. And in many cases, parties then, well, technically there's no mechanism for sharing impact assessments at that level in the international context. There's a very heartening practice where information on initial environmental evaluations, which is the next level up, parties are required to share the fact that they've done one and the name and details of that evaluation. And in most cases, parties are, as a matter of practice, sharing the actual content of those evaluations. So I think this is to some extent a question of scale. But I mean, I think it's incredibly healthy that we see parties whose formal international obligation is to notify that they've carried out an initial environmental evaluation, taking the next step and sharing that publicly through the ATS website, which is not an obligation, but also in many cases doing that in languages which are accessible to many, because there's also no obligation for that to be done in anything other than their own domestic context. And we know it's that the parties to the treaty don't all operate in one of the official languages themselves or in their national programs. So that's a long-winded, short answer. Thanks.
Thank you. Phil Tracy from Australia, from the Australian Antarctic Division, that was. Anais.
Hi, good morning everyone. So my name is Anais. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Wollongong, and actually transparency is the core topic of my PhD. So I'm looking at all these aspects within the Antarctic Treaty System decision-making process. And I had the chance of attending the 2 last week, so I was there for the ATCM, and my question to the panelists will be, and maybe it could be a little bit redundant with what Phil just said, but what could be the practical step forward? We are talking about transparency, that's great, but what could be the next practical steps in order to actually implement it? Because there is some ideas in other systems that could be maybe translated in the Antarctic Treaty System context. So in your view, what could be the next practical steps? Thanks.
I'm handing over to the panel. Bill.
Thank you very much. First, I'm going to add one point to Phil's excellent intervention, is that we found that in unannounced inspections that has at times resulted in the countries making those inspection reports to comment upon the quality or lack thereof of environmental impact assessments for actions that are occurring at stations. So there is at least in those activities, some acknowledgement by the countries conducting the inspections that such information is valuable and desired, and that they do comment upon that in their inspection reports. As for transparency, oh my gosh, there is so much that could be done. All it takes is will. And so I know I mentioned earlier that, okay, embrace the differences between the different ATS agreements. Okay, but then on the flip side, use them as a springboard to level up. So from my perspective, in the 1980s, the ATCM went through the process of transforming its standard behavior to being that papers were private to being that all papers are made public. And that took the course of 4 years, essentially, or 2 meetings, to make that transformation. And now that system that has worked out since 1987, I believe, has maintained in that virtually all papers are immediately made public after the conclusion of the meeting. That, unfortunately, is not the case for CAMLR. I cannot figure out why that is the case, that one needs to make a special request that can get denied for no apparent reason, other than some country has chosen not to grant that access. So I find that to be a rather odd situation, that an agreement, the ATCM, a meeting that focuses on broad sovereignty issues, is more transparent than a relatively confined commercial and environmental agreement. So that'd be a good place to start. I commend Japan for hosting multiple press conferences. Any and all countries can increase their own activities for transparency without reference to any other. It's great to do, though, as a group. I better stop.
Nengye, first.
Yeah, thank you. I must admit, this hot topic that has been discussed is relatively new in my brain and in my mind, so I haven't really followed that much in the past. But the more I have been hearing all the discussions and questions, I think, at least to my mind, there seems to be 2 dimensions of this transparency question. I understand there is a domestic dimension. I think for most democracies, of course, transparency is natural, that the government must share information and also give more access to the public what they are doing in Antarctica. But I also find that there is somehow a bit of missing discussions there, which is connected to what Sanjay just mentioned, which I also call it international dimension. That is, the world has a right to know what's going on. And the world is not just 29 consulted parties in the ATCM. So I'm just wondering, this is more like a question rather than a suggestion, is that I think it seems that the capacity building is somehow, to me, is also part of transparency, which is related to the international dimension, but which seems to be a missing component in the ATCM so far. Like, if we want people to know, what about African countries? What about Caribbean countries? Pacific Islanders? They also have a right to know. And how could we do that? I think even countries like Malaysia, I was told that they rely on some other countries' Antarctic program to conduct their own expeditions. So I think this is something maybe that needs to be discussed a bit more within this ATCM community. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll ask the panel to be very brief because there's one more question and I'm sticking to time. Panel, Sanjay.
Very quick one. I think the point that you made about best practices is very important, because on the one hand, Antarctic Treaty System can be a provider of best practices, but at the same time, there are best practices in other regimes which one should be looking at. See, in recent times, we have seen a lot of debate within Arctic Council or with regard to Arctic Council or IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association, as to what is the role of categories like observer states, experts, in our case, non-consultative parties. I think there is a need for greater reflection on their role, so that we get maximum value out of their participation. Another point is, Antarctic Treaty System is no longer as state-centric as it was during 1950s. For example, if you talk about tourism, you have IATO. So the concept of transparency does not simply apply to the state parties. It also applies to the industries which are making their inroads into the space of Antarctic governance. So I think this public-private partnership or interplay will also become extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to finish up now, but I'm going to give Katie Marks the chance. Katie Marks from the University of Tasmania, the privilege of one last question.
G'day everyone, thank you for the privilege. One more transparency question for you. What I'm seeing around the table and around the room right now is a kind of collective effort to come to some kind of collective definition of what transparency means and looks like within the context of the ATCM. So my question is, how important is it for parties to arrive at a collective definition, and how granular should that be? Are there moments where it might be useful to have a fuzzy definition that can attract broad, in principle, support from parties? And are there moments where we might want to aim for something more granular to get progress in a specific area? Which is useful when, basically?
I'm actually going to take the writer's chair to attempt to answer at least some of your question. And that is, you don't create a thing because you want to create a thing. You actually create a thing because you want to solve a problem. And so it depends on what part of transparency you're talking about as to what might be the appropriate way of doing it. And that's the way I would approach it. And seeing that it's now 10:51 and a half, I just want to thank my fabulous panel for their great contributions. I noticed that everybody was awake for the whole session, so thank you for keeping them all awake. But more importantly, thank you for the depth of intellectual contribution to this seminar series. Thank you very much.